So we have a third pillar up here today, and you're probably saying, but we didn't get to the second one last week because you had sinus infection. We will get to that at the end of the month, I promise. But as we continue to unfold this great vision of the four pillars of Acts 2:42, they held fast to the apostles' teaching and fellowship, the breaking of the bread, and then soon we'll get next week, prayers. This week we're tackling the breaking of bread. The act that we're doing right here, right now, was called by the early church not the Eucharist, not Holy Communion, but was called the breaking of the bread. Imagine that on our front sign. The breaking of the bread starts at 10 o'clock at All Saints Episcopal. Why the breaking of the bread? Why the act that we're doing right here, the title that they gave it, was the breaking of bread? All four of these pillars in Acts 2:42, how the early church became church, have to do with how they confronted Jesus. We talked about the apostles' teaching. It wasn't St. Peter coming out to the crowd he just baptized and handing them the Book of Common Prayer or catechism and saying, here, memorize this. It's not what they did. They asked questions, just like they did in the gospel today. Who is Jesus? Who is Jesus? What was he like? What was he like when he was with you guys? And they began to explain his teachings. That's the apostles' teaching. They encountered Jesus in fellowship. They encountered Jesus in each other. They encountered Jesus in the breaking of the bread, and they encountered Jesus when they were out in the streets in prayer. These four pillars are ways in which we encounter Christ. But why was the title, The Breaking of Bread, so important? Remember, Acts 2:42 happens only about 50, 60 days after all of the events of the Last Supper and Good Friday and Easter. They're still wet behind the ears on what happened with Jesus. They still have those memories very, very strongly of those days of grace and mercy. So you got to put yourselves into their shoes. Because when did they first see him break bread? Oh yeah, they saw it for 3 years with him. Anytime they gathered for a meal, one of the first things that you would do during a Jewish meal is there would have been a prayer, then the bread would have been broken and passed out. They were there for a couple Passovers with him. But that Passover was different. They knew it was different when they walked in the upper room. You could see it on his face that this Last Supper was different. This breaking of the bread wasn't like any of the breaking of the bread that they have done before. The Gospel of John says he longed to have this meal with them. He longed. In the upper room, you could imagine the look on his face. For John to put that in there, that was in the mind of the disciples who were seeing this on his face. And I'm sure he was just beyond glowing with love at this moment. John says he loved his own who were in the world, and he loved them to the end, and he longed to have this meal with them. This meal, in 6 hours, would be the catalyst for him shedding his blood. He loved them. And because he loved them, he took bread in his hands. The blessing was different than it was any other night. This is my body. Not a symbol, not a sign. This is my body, which will be given for you. This is my blood, as he took the chalice. The blood of the new covenant, which is shed for you and for many so that sins can be forgiven. And he breaks the bread and hands it to them. This is my body given for you. In 7 hours, 8 hours, I will begin to physically give my body for you. This bread that I hold in my hand gets fulfilled on the cross. This wine that I hold will be symbols of my blood that will pour out on the wood of the cross. Why? Because I love you. Because I don't want to see you broken anymore. Because I want to see you made whole. Because I want you to know salvation. because I want you to know that love lasts forever, because I want you to know that you are loved beyond all things, and it doesn't matter where you come from or who you are or your gender or your sexual orientation or any of that. I love you deeply to the point where I will give my very body so that you could have life. And the breaking of the bread is a reminder to all of us of that love. The breaking of the bread reminds us of how he was broken on the cross so that we could have life. The Eucharist is tangible love. And they called it the breaking of the bread is because when the bread is broken, we see how much he loves us. Every single person in this room, if you were the only person who had sin, he would come down and be broken for you. That's how much he loves you. But it doesn't stop there. Because love does not know death. And that love steps out of the grave 2 days later into a risen life, where we are given a new life. We become church. We are made community. And the disciples are on their way to Emmaus thinking about all of that. How much love he showed to us the night before. Now he's gone. He's dead. We watched him die on the cross. And he appears in the middle of them and begins to tell them all in the scriptures that related to him. And then he sits at table with those two disciples. And what does he do? He breaks bread. And it's in the breaking of the bread that their eyes were opened and they recognized him. Because it's in the breaking of the bread that we know his love and we know how much he loves us. The breaking of the bread has all of that tied in. One of the hardest things for me to do as a priest is to break the bread. Here in a few short moments, I'll lift up the host and say the same words that Jesus said, the chalice the same way, and then you crack the host, and it almost sends a chill down my spine. Because he was broken so that we can have life, and we can have love. And he sits at table now with us, with all of this tremendous and powerful love, and invites you. You are his guest at the table. You are his guest at this wedding feast. He is longing to commune with you. Jesus longed to have this meal with his disciples, and he continues to long to have this meal with every single one of you. You are guests at this table. The breaking of the bread should remind you how much he loves you deeply, unbridled, passionate, unconditional, total love for you. You are loved because of Jesus. And the Eucharist is our moment where we tangibly hold that love in our hands. And it transforms us. It transforms us. That's the power of the breaking of the bread, is it not only reminds us of Jesus, but he loves us so much, he comes into us. So that very love is now throbbing through your veins. His heart is now beating in your veins. It is to transform us into the inside, to know how much we are loved. To know no matter who we are, we're loved by him. And that the people sitting next to you are his guests also. And they are loved and called by God to be here just as much as you are. That should transform us from the inside out. One of my favorite authors, Rowan Williams, who was the last Archbishop of Canterbury, wrote a cool book on being Christian. In fact, we're going to start tackling it in some of our Tuesday Bible studies. But one thing he says in there is that moment right after communion, where all of us have received our Lord, you can feel the peace in this room. You can feel the unity in this room. You can feel the love in this room. It may just be for a few seconds because our mind is going to breakfast. Our mind is going to events later. But in those few short moments, we are transformed. And the more we get to know Jesus in the Eucharist, in the breaking of the bread, the more our lives are transformed to be the people he's called us to be the love that he's called us to be the love that we're receiving in our hands. St. Augustine says, be what you see. Be the love that you're holding in your hands in the breaking of the bread, and then take that love to a world that's broken and needs us. We receive communion and we have Eucharist, not because it's a reward or a nice thing to do. We have Eucharist because we're dirty and we're broken And we need that love to transform us from the inside and out. As we grow as Episcopalians, we're coming to realize how deeply the Eucharist is important to us. There was a time in our tradition where you'd have Eucharist 4 or 5 times a year. Now it's every Sunday. And at General Convention, it was every day. When we had our 9 days of prayer, it was every day. Why? Because we need it. We need the breaking of the bread to break us, to break our selfishness so love can reign. And we can be that love in the breaking of the bread. Our third pillar is all of that. Our third pillar is encountering Christ in the sacramental life of the church, and most especially the Eucharist, and how we allow ourselves to be transformed. Today, when you see the breaking of the bread, hear it. Don't see it. Hear it, because you're going to hear it crack. And realize he was broken so that you could have life and you could have love. And that brokenness is now transformed by the cross and resurrection to be nothing but total love.